Long before detectives questioned Casey Anthony, her family had already learned that even ordinary facts about her life could become elaborate stories. The trouble was that nobody yet knew which lie would eventually matter most. Casey Anthony was born on March 19, 1986, in Ohio. She was the younger of two children born to Cindy and George Anthony. Her brother, Lee, was 4 years older. The family eventually settled in the Orlando area, where George had a background in law enforcement and Cindy worked as a nurse. In later recollections, they described Casey as an energetic, intelligent little girl. She had once been close to her parents. She talked to them. She let them into her world. Then adolescence changed the arrangement. Friends and relatives described Casey developing a habit of lying, sometimes about things so minor that the lie seemed to serve no obvious purpose. These were not always stories designed to escape serious consequences. They could involve ordinary questions with easily checked answers. That was what made the pattern so difficult to understand. Why invent a story when the truth barely mattered? At the same time, Casey began pulling away from her family. She still lived under her parents' roof, but George and Cindy knew less and less about her social life. They did not always know who her closest friends were, where she had been, or whom she was dating. Casey liked being in relationships and rarely seemed comfortable without a boyfriend. She also went out, stayed away late, and kept much of that life separate from the one at home. The clearest warning came near the end of high school. George and Cindy believed their daughter was about to graduate. They prepared cards, invited people, and began planning a celebration. Yet when they tried to get basic information about the ceremony, Casey would not give them a straight answer. Finally, they contacted the school. Casey was not graduating. She had not completed the necessary work and was failing multiple classes. Think about the scale of that for a second. This was not one impulsive denial after a bad report card. Casey had allowed her parents to prepare for a ceremony she knew she could not attend. By the time they learned the truth, the celebration had already been built around an event that was never going to happen. She left school without graduating and later worked at Universal Studios, including a period at the Hard Rock Cafe. That detail matters because the job itself was real. Casey could talk about the workplace, the people there, and the rhythms of a normal shift because she had experienced them. But the employment ended. The story did not. Years later, Casey would continue talking as though she still had a job at Universal. A genuine part of her past became the foundation for a much larger fiction. And because the first layer was true, the rest could sound convincing. At least until someone checked. In 2005, Casey was in a relationship with Jesse Grund. That same year, she became pregnant. Accounts differed over exactly when different members of the Anthony family understood what was happening. What is clear is that the pregnancy was not openly discussed from the beginning. Casey was petite, wore loose clothing, and concealed the pregnancy for months. Cindy later described the moment Casey finally told her.
He looks
He just kind of rolled in the day before the baby was born.
Yeah,
and I just like...
His first impression of Jesse wasn't that great.
It was the first of many lies the Anthonys say Casey would tell. A DNA test reportedly showed Jesse was not the baby.
That is the family's version of the disclosure, a direct announcement after a doctor's appointment. But even within the family, the pregnancy became another subject surrounded by secrecy and conflicting memories. Lee was reportedly told very late and felt deeply excluded. What should have drawn the household together instead exposed how selectively information moved through it. Casey had considered adoption. George and Cindy strongly opposed that idea and wanted the baby raised within the family. On August 9th, 2005, Kaylee Marie Anthony was born. Before Kaylee became a name in court filings and television coverage, she was a little girl growing up in a busy family home. She had her own Winnie the Pooh-themed bedroom. She played in the backyard and swam in the family pool. Cindy remembered Kaylee waking her by touching her face. In photographs, she appears curious, expressive, and closely connected to the adults around her. George's memories carried the uncomplicated affection of a grandfather who believed this child had expanded his family.
Just so many things about her just made me think like, wow, I got another little girl in my life that's going to be, you know, someone I can hold on to and cherish and just be so connected to and close to.
The Anthonys shared these never-before-seen photos of that wonderful time when Kaylee was growing.
That is the Kaylee who can disappear beneath the arguments about evidence. A child who was held, photographed, taken swimming, and cherished. She was not merely the subject of a future missing person report. She had routines, a room, favorite people, a place in that house. The identity of Kaylee's biological father remained uncertain. Casey initially identified Jesse Grund, and Jesse embraced both Casey and the baby. On New Year's Eve, he proposed, hoping the three of them could become a family. DNA testing later excluded Jesse as Kaylee's biological father. The result devastated him, but biology did not immediately erase the attachment he had formed. Jesse still cared for Kaylee and initially wanted the relationship to work. By May 2006, however, he ended the engagement. He later described Casey's behavior as increasingly erratic and said she seemed to be changing. Casey soon returned to an active social life. She went out with friends and eventually began dating Tony Lazaro, an aspiring DJ. She brought Kaylee to the apartment Tony shared with roommates, and Casey increasingly spent time in that social circle. Back at the Anthony home, George and Cindy continued providing the practical structure around Kaylee's life. They housed her. They bought clothing and food. They gave her a bedroom and helped care for her while Casey said she was working or away. But there was another supposed caregiver in the picture. Casey frequently spoke about a babysitter named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, usually shortened to Zanny. According to Casey, Zanny had been introduced through a Universal Studios connection and helped care for Kaylee. Casey supplied enough detail to make the arrangement sound established. Cindy even recalled Kaylee mentioning Zanny and a dog. Yet no one in the Anthony family appeared to have met this woman. That should have been a simple gap to close. A grandmother as involved as Cindy could have asked to meet the person regularly caring for Kaylee. George could have requested an address or telephone number. But Casey's explanations kept the arrangement at a distance and daily life continued. That was the contradiction inside the Anthony home. Kaylee appeared surrounded by involved grandparents who loved her and helped raise her. At the same time, crucial facts about where she went, who watched her, and what Casey did during the day depended almost entirely on Casey's word. By June 2008, the house contained genuine affection for Kaylee, but little reliable clarity about Casey's work, relationships, or childcare arrangements. The invented details had not yet become a police matter. Then came June 16th, the last day Kaylee was independently confirmed to have been seen alive. After that date, every update about her came through Casey. A missing toddler would normally trigger calls, searches, and panic within hours. In this case, a full month passed before anyone contacted police. That month began with tension inside the Anthony home. According to Casey, there was a heated family argument on June 15th, 2008. The next morning, she left the house with Kaylee. She said she was angry, that she did not want to come back, and that she had a work trip in Tampa. She packed as though she and her daughter might be gone for a while. June 16th would become the last confirmed date Kaylee Anthony was seen alive. That wording matters. It does not tell us what happened to her that day. It does not establish how she died when she died, or who was responsible. Those questions would remain disputed all the way through Casey's trial. What June 16th gives us is a line in the timeline. Before it, other people had seen Kaylee. After it, Casey kept saying Kaylee was safe, but nobody in the family could actually see her. Casey went to the apartment of her new boyfriend, Tony Lazaro, an aspiring DJ who lived with roommates in Orlando. Witnesses saw Casey there. They did not see Kaylee. Whenever someone asked where her daughter was, Casey had an answer ready. Kaylee was with her nanny, Zanny. She was asleep. She was traveling with Casey. She was somewhere else for the day. There was always a reason the child was unavailable, and no single excuse initially sounded dramatic enough to trigger a missing person investigation. That is how the separation stretched out. Not as one clearly announced month, but in smaller pieces. 1 week became 2. A work obligation became travel between cities. A delay became car trouble. Cindy kept calling and asking about her granddaughter. Casey kept reassuring her that everything was fine. The family later described how those explanations accumulated.
Because as she got older, she started to call me either Cece or Grammy Cece.
But the good times were about to end when Casey told her parents she was taking Kaylee with her as she traveled between jobs in Jacksonville and Tampa for a week.
And then that trip for a week extended into another week because she told me her car was having issues and she had to take it to get it fixed.
That is the unsettling part. The absence did not arrive labeled as a crisis. It arrived as a series of ordinary inconveniences: work, travel, repairs, another night away. Each explanation bought a little more time. And underneath all of it was another lie. Casey continued telling her family that she worked in event planning connected to Universal Studios. She spoke as though she still had a job there and described work-related trips that supposedly kept her moving between Orlando, Tampa, and Jacksonville. But Casey no longer held that job. Her family was building its understanding of where she was and why Kaylee could not come to the phone, around employment that did not exist. Meanwhile, Casey remained at Tony's apartment and went out with him and his friends. There were nights at local clubs. There were photographs of her smiling, drinking, and socializing. She participated in a nightclub event described as a hot body contest. She also got a tattoo reading Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. Those details became impossible for the public to forget, but they need to be handled carefully. Going to a club does not prove homicide. Smiling in a photograph does not establish what happened to Kaylee. A tattoo is not forensic evidence. The significance is narrower and still difficult to explain. During the same period when Casey said her daughter was repeatedly unavailable, she did not report Kaylee missing. She did not call police and say the nanny had refused to return her. She did not publicly organize a search. Instead, she continued assuring her family that Kaylee was safe while living a social life in which witnesses saw Casey, but not her child. Then the Anthony family's car forced the situation into the open. Casey had been driving the family's white Pontiac Sunfire. At some point, the car ran out of gas near an Amscot check-cashing business. Rather than arranging to refuel or recover it, Casey left it there. The vehicle remained in the parking lot until it was towed. It then sat at an impound lot in the Florida summer heat until George and Cindy Anthony were notified. George went to retrieve it. He had previously worked in law enforcement, and when he approached the Sunfire, the smell immediately concerned him. He later said the odor reminded him of human decomposition. An employee at the lot also remarked that the car smelled as though a dead body had been inside it. George brought the vehicle home and asked Cindy to smell it. Her initial reaction was alarm as well. Inside the trunk, they found a trash bag containing decomposing refuse. Accounts described garbage and old food, including pizza, that had been left to rot in intense heat. That trash would become important for two completely different reasons. To Cindy, it offered a possible innocent explanation for the odor. To investigators, the smell from the trunk would demand much closer examination. At this point, however, the family did not know what the car could prove. They only knew that Casey had abandoned it without telling them, and that Kaylee was still nowhere in sight. Now the stories about work, travel, and car repairs began colliding with physical reality. The car had not been repaired in Tampa. It had been sitting near an Amscot in the Orlando area. Casey was not moving between legitimate jobs, and the vehicle she claimed was causing delays had been left behind long enough to be impounded. The moment those facts converged was later described this way.
In the trunk, there were bags of trash, rotting in the hot Florida summer sun. Cindy says that's when she learned that Casey's jobs didn't exist, and she wasn't in Tampa, but in a suburb of Orlando.
I had found Casey that.
Finding Casey required Cindy to stop waiting for another explanation and go looking for her. She went to Tony Lazzaro's apartment. Casey was there. Kaylee was not. Cindy demanded to know where her granddaughter was and insisted that Casey take her to the child. Casey repeated the familiar answer. Kaylee was with Zanny, the nanny. But after weeks of being told that Kaylee was asleep, away, traveling, or otherwise unavailable, Cindy was no longer willing to accept another delay. The confrontation moved back to the Anthony family home. Casey remained defensive and continued insisting that Kaylee was with the nanny. Cindy, now furious and frightened, called 911. Her first complaint included the abandoned car and money she said Casey had taken. But beneath that family dispute was the real emergency. A 3-year-old child had not been seen by her grandparents for a month. The Sunfire had finally broken the cycle. Until then, every question had been answered with another plausible-sounding obstacle. Now Cindy had the car. She had found Casey. The supposed work trips were unraveling. Yet finding her daughter only exposed the larger fact. Nobody in the family could locate Kaylee. While Cindy waited for police, she overheard Casey speaking to her brother, Lee. Casey said she had met Zanny at a park to collect Kaylee, but the nanny had held the child close, pushed Casey away, and refused to give her back. After 31 days of excuses, Casey was no longer saying Kaylee was merely unavailable. She was claiming that Kaylee had been kidnapped. Casey gave police a name, a physical description, an apartment, and a detailed history for the woman she said had Kaylee. Specificity should have made the nanny easier to find. Instead, every detail made the story collapse faster. But the investigation did not begin with the nanny. It began with Cindy Anthony trying to have her own daughter arrested. Cindy called 911 3 times on July 15th, 2008. During the first call, she focused on the family's car and money she said Casey had taken. Casey had abandoned the vehicle, leaving George and Cindy to recover it from an impound lot. Cindy wanted officers at the house. She told the dispatcher there was someone in her home who needed to be arrested. Then she added something far more urgent. There might also be a missing child. At that point, Cindy knew she had not seen Kaylee in roughly a month. She had finally located Casey, but her granddaughter was still nowhere to be found. As Cindy waited for police, she overheard Casey speaking with her brother, Lee. Casey offered a new explanation. She said she had taken Kaylee to meet the nanny at a park. According to her account, the woman had held Kaylee tightly, pushed Casey away, and said she would not return the child. Now this was no longer a family argument over a car. Casey appeared to be describing an abduction. Cindy called 911 again. Her frustration was turning into panic. She had found her daughter after weeks of excuses, but Casey still could not, or would not, bring her to Kaylee. Cindy demanded an officer. She said the babysitter had taken the child and that Kaylee had been missing for a month. Then came the third call. This time, Cindy connected Kaylee's disappearance to the odor inside the recovered car. She pushed Casey to speak directly with the dispatcher, while Casey sounded far calmer than anyone would expect from a mother reporting a missing 2-year-old. Listen to how quickly the dispatcher recognized the problem.
I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car.
And this time, Casey gets on the phone and gives a rather flimsy explanation to the dispatcher.
My daughter's been missing for the last 31 days. Why are you calling now? Why didn't you?
That was the question. Not only where was Kaylee, but why had her mother waited 31 days before involving police? Casey said she had been conducting her own search. She claimed she had used other resources rather than contacting law enforcement. She also insisted that she knew who had Kaylee, a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, usually called Zanny. The details shifted depending on whom Casey was speaking to. She said the nanny's telephone number was no longer in service, yet also claimed she had recently communicated with her. She told the dispatcher that she had spoken with Zanny on July 9th and again on July 15th. During the later call, Casey said she had been allowed to speak with Kaylee and knew the child was safe. Casey gave Lee another layer of the story. She said Zanny had been contacting her through MySpace and issuing instructions about what Casey needed to do to get Kaylee back. At another point, she suggested the nanny had promised to return Kaylee around the child's birthday. Think about what investigators were being asked to accept. A woman had supposedly taken a toddler and withheld her for a month. The child's mother claimed to be receiving calls and online instructions from that woman. Yet she had not gone to police, had not triggered an Amber Alert, and had not publicly asked for help. Officers needed somewhere concrete to begin. Casey gave them the Sawgrass Apartments. She led police to the complex and identified the unit where she said Zanny lived. This, Casey told them, was where she had left Kaylee and the last place she had seen her daughter. She also supplied a remarkably precise description. Zanny was supposedly 25 years old, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, and approximately 140 pounds. Casey described her as having black hair and perfect teeth. She said Zanny was from New York, had moved to attend the University of Florida, and was black and Puerto Rican. She even rated the woman's appearance as a 10. It sounded detailed, almost rehearsed. Then officers checked the apartment. Nobody answered because nobody lived there. Management records showed that the unit Casey identified had been vacant since March, months before the alleged June handoff. Investigators looked for surveillance footage and other evidence that might place either the nanny or Kaylee at the complex. They found nothing supporting Casey's account. The address was real. The apartment was real. The story attached to them was not holding up. There was also a real woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. She had a similar name to the person Casey described, but she denied being Kaylee's nanny and denied involvement in the disappearance. When Casey was shown a photograph of that woman, she could not identify her as Zanny. The existence of a real Zenaida did not rescue Casey's story. It made the problem sharper. Investigators had found a person whose name resembled the one Casey supplied, but not the nanny Casey claimed had cared for Kaylee. The real Zenaida later filed a defamation lawsuit against Casey. That civil action addressed the harm she said she suffered after her name became tied to a nationally known missing child case. It did not establish what happened to Kaylee. It only underscored that an uninvolved woman had been pulled into the investigation by Casey's account, and the nanny was not the only person officers could not locate. Casey also said she worked at Universal Studios. She had spoken for years as though she still had a job there, naming coworkers and describing events from her working life. Detectives checked. Casey had worked at Universal in the past, but she no longer worked there. They did not immediately confront her with that fact. Instead, they gave Casey an opportunity to demonstrate whether any part of the employment story was true. Investigators took her to Universal Studios and asked her to lead them to her office and supervisor. Casey walked through the employee entrance and continued into the building. She guided detectives along corridors, deeper into an area where she supposedly worked. But there was no office waiting for her, no current supervisor, no coworker who could confirm that she belonged there. She kept walking. That is the strange part. Even with detectives beside her, even inside the workplace itself, Casey continued the performance. She led them through the maze of offices until there was nowhere useful left to go. Finally, she stopped, turned to the investigators, and admitted it. She did not work there. Within hours, police had dismantled two major parts of Casey's account. Zanny could not be found at the apartment Casey identified, and the unit had been vacant. Casey's supposed job, the place from which several elements of her story had grown, did not exist either. On July 16th, Casey was arrested. The charges included child neglect, obstruction of justice, and providing false information to law enforcement. By then, Kaylee's disappearance was moving beyond the Anthony family and the first group of detectives. Missing child posters began appearing. Volunteers joined community searches. News outlets picked up the story, and attention expanded rapidly around the mother who had waited 31 days to report her daughter missing. The public could see the contradictions. Investigators could prove them. But proving that Casey lied was not the same as finding Kaylee. Every false address, invented coworker, disconnected telephone number, and changing claim consumed time without answering the central question. Detectives now had compelling evidence of deception, but no reliable account of where Kaylee had gone after June 16th, or what had happened to her. The next potential witness could not speak. It was Casey's car, and investigators believed its trunk might preserve evidence of something far worse than abandonment. A cadaver dog alerted near the trunk. A microscopic hair showed signs associated with decomposition. Chemical testing produced reports of compounds linked to human remains, and chloroform. Those details sounded conclusive when repeated on television, but almost every powerful sounding result came with a limitation the public rarely heard in full. The Pontiac Sunfire first drew attention before it entered a laboratory. When George Anthony collected the impounded car, he and an employee at the tow yard noticed a strong, disturbing odor. George, a former police officer, believed he recognized the smell of human decomposition. Cindy smelled it too. On her 911 call, she said the car smelled as though a dead body had been inside it, but the trunk also contained garbage. Cindy later described a trash bag and a pizza box with maggots. She said she threw the trash away, sprayed the interior with an entire bottle of Febreze, and left the doors open to air out the vehicle. That created an immediate problem. Witnesses could describe what they believed they had smelled, but smell is subjective. Rotting food can produce an awful odor. Cleaning products and exposure to open air can alter a scene. And saying that something smells like decomposition is not the same as scientifically proving that a particular person's body was there. Police seized the Sunfire and began processing it as evidence. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and alerts were reported around the trunk. These dogs are trained to respond to odors associated with human decomposition. They can be extremely useful for directing investigators toward a location that deserves closer examination. But an alert has boundaries. A dog cannot identify whose remains produced an odor. It cannot establish when a body was present, how that person died, or whether a specific crime occurred. The alert was a lead supporting further analysis, not a laboratory identification of Kaylee. Investigators also observed staining in the trunk and removed sections of carpet for testing. Some results were interpreted as consistent with decomposition. That interpretation became part of the state's developing theory, but the exact meaning of the chemical evidence would remain disputed. The defense would later challenge whether the testing reliably established that a human body had decomposed there at all. Then there was the hair. Examiners recovered a strand from the trunk and tested its mitochondrial DNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, which can often distinguish one person from another, mitochondrial DNA follows the maternal line. Kaylee, Casey, and Cindy shared that maternal lineage, so the test could associate the hair with the maternal Anthony family line. It could not uniquely declare, this hair belonged to Kaylee. Other characteristics made the strand more significant to prosecutors. It was described as longer than Casey's hair and untreated in a way that differed from Cindy's. Most important, an examiner identified what was called a post-mortem root band, a darkened feature that had been associated with hair removed from a decomposing body. Again, dramatic. Again, contested. The prosecution treated those combined details as circumstantial evidence that Kaylee's body had been inside the trunk. The defense challenged the reliability and scientific certainty of post-mortem banding. Even if jurors accepted that the strand came from a decomposing member of the maternal Anthony line, mitochondrial testing alone could not name that person. Air samples taken from the vehicle generated another forensic battle. Testing reportedly detected compounds associated with human decomposition, along with evidence interpreted as an unusually high level of chloroform. That single word, chloroform, changed the public conversation. Chloroform can cause unconsciousness and, at sufficient exposure, death. Combined with the missing child, the odor, and Casey's repeated lies, it gave prosecutors the beginning of a possible mechanism. Kaylee may have been rendered unconscious before her death, but the testing did not show who introduced the chemical, why it was present, or whether Kaylee had been exposed to it. Questions were raised about the methodology, the reported concentration, comparisons with decomposition databases, and whether the compounds could have originated from ordinary materials or the trash left in the car. The evidence sounded like an answer. In court, it was an argument. Investigators then turned to the Anthony family computer. Searches presented during the case included terms related to chloroform, neck breaking, and other disturbing subjects. Prosecutors argued that the timing placed Casey at home and suggested research connected to Kaylee's death. Cindy offered a different explanation. She said she had been researching the family's dogs because they were eating bamboo in the yard. According to Cindy, she meant to search for chlorophyll, the pigment that makes plants green, and reached information about chloroform during that research. Her work records became important because they appeared to show that she was at work when at least some searches occurred. Cindy disputed what those records proved and maintained that she could have been home. Once again, the computer evidence created suspicion without producing a complete timeline everyone accepted. And there was another search the jury never heard about. Years later, investigators acknowledged that a Firefox browser search for foolproof suffocation had been overlooked. The original computer examination had concentrated on a different browser, leaving relevant Firefox history outside the evidence presented at trial. That distinction matters. The jury considered the searches introduced in court. It did not consider foolproof suffocation. Whatever weight that later discovery might carry in public debate, it cannot be treated as evidence the jurors ignored. They never received it. While specialists examined the car and computer, Casey's family continued trying to extract something usable from her nanny story. During jail conversations, Cindy pressed Casey for a photograph or a clear description of Zanny. If police produced a lineup, Cindy asked, how was she supposed to identify a woman she had never met? Casey became irritated and shut down rather than giving her mother a practical way to help find the person she claimed had Kaylee. At the same time, Cindy's position on the car began to shift. Her recorded 911 statement had been blunt. It smelled like a dead body had been in the vehicle. Later, she emphasized the rotting pizza and garbage. As scrutiny intensified, her public posture became increasingly protective of Casey. That did not prove Cindy knew what had happened. It showed a family dividing under pressure. George appeared more willing to consider that the odor meant something terrible. Cindy resisted conclusions that pointed toward her daughter. Casey hired Jose Baez as her defense attorney. He notified authorities that she was willing to cooperate, and a judge eventually set bond at $500,000. After the bond was paid, Casey left jail wearing an electronic monitoring device and returned to her parents' house. By then, the house was no longer private. News cameras lined the street. Protesters gathered outside. Arguments erupted near the driveway. Neighbors found their block consumed by lights, shouting, and round-the-clock coverage. The case had moved beyond a missing child investigation and become a national spectacle, with strangers reaching conclusions faster than forensic laboratories could test them. Then Casey was arrested again on unrelated allegations that she had written 4 checks, totaling close to $650, without the account holder's permission. Her parents posted another bond, and she was released back into their custody. Through all of this, one fact remained easy to lose. Kaylee was still missing. The vehicle and computer evidence gave prosecutors the outline of a circumstantial case, not a complete reconstruction. Investigators could argue that a decomposing body may have been associated with the Sunfire. They could point to a maternal line hair, disputed chemical results, troubling internet searches, and a mother whose account had repeatedly collapsed. But they still could not show precisely when Kaylee died. They could not establish where she died. And without her remains, they could not determine a cause of death. For nearly 6 months, that gap remained. Then a utility worker stepped into woods less than a mile from the Anthony home and saw what looked like a small human skull. Kaylee was not found across the state or hidden at some distant destination. Her remains were recovered less than a mile from the house where her grandparents had been waiting for her to return, and the location had not gone unnoticed. Roy Kronk was a utility meter reader working in the Orlando area. Months before the discovery, he had noticed something suspicious in a wooded area off Suburban Drive. The site sat close to the Anthony home, but it was easy to miss from the road. Thick vegetation covered much of the ground, and seasonal flooding could leave parts of it underwater. Kronk contacted authorities more than once in August 2008. He reported what he believed might be a human skull. Those calls became a source of controversy because deputies did not locate any remains at the time. One response was incomplete. Another deputy reportedly conducted only a limited inspection. The area was wet, visibility was poor, and whatever Kronk had seen was not recovered. Then months passed. That delay raised an obvious question. If the site had been properly searched in August, could Kaylee have been found sooner? There was never a simple answer. The wooded ground changed with the weather. Water levels rose and fell. Vegetation shifted. But the earlier reports would later face intense scrutiny, especially once everyone understood how close investigators had come to the recovery site. On December 11th, 2008, Kronk returned to the area. This time, he stepped roughly 20 feet from the road and examined the suspicious object more closely. When he realized it appeared to be a human skull, he called 911 again. This call brought investigators to the right place. The recovery site was treated as a crime scene. Search teams moved carefully through the wet, overgrown terrain, documenting what they found and trying to reconstruct a scene that had been exposed to water, weather, animals, and months of environmental change. The remains were scattered. Nearby, investigators recovered bags and a small blanket decorated with Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. Duct tape was found associated with the skull area. None of it offered the clean, preserved scene detectives might have hoped for. The condition of the site had erased context that could never be restored. Still, the size of the remains left little doubt that they belonged to a young child. 8 days later, on December 19th, DNA testing confirmed the identification. The remains were those of Kaylee Marie Anthony. The missing child search was over. Now, the case was about her death. The medical examiner ruled the manner of death a homicide. That ruling meant Kaylee's death was attributed to the actions of another person rather than natural disease, accident, or suicide. But the exact cause of death could not be determined. The remains had been outside too long, and there was no longer enough physical evidence to establish one specific fatal mechanism. That distinction became one of the most important in the entire case. Investigators could prove Kaylee had died. They could establish that her remains had been concealed near her family's home. What they could not prove from the remains alone was precisely how she died. The objects found with her narrowed the investigation, but they did not identify one person as the killer. The Winnie the Pooh blanket drew immediate attention because Kaylee's bedroom had been decorated in the same theme. Investigators also examined a laundry bag recovered at the scene. A similar bag was found at the Anthony property, and the bags were associated with a product sold in pairs. Those links mattered. They suggested that whoever placed Kaylee in the woods may have had access to items from the Anthony home. But a household object is not a fingerprint. It could connect the recovery site to the residence without proving which person carried it there. The duct tape became even more consequential. For prosecutors, it was a central exhibit. Their eventual theory was that tape had been placed over Kaylee's mouth and nose, obstructing her airway. If accepted, that interpretation could help supply the mechanism of death that the medical examination could not establish. But the position and purpose of the tape were disputed. The remains had been exposed for months. The skull and other materials had shifted. The defense would later argue that investigators could not reliably reconstruct where the tape had originally been placed or prove that it had been used to suffocate Kaylee. So the same item produced two very different pictures. To the state, the tape suggested an intentional killing. To the defense, it was an ambiguous object recovered from a badly compromised outdoor scene. Police searched the Anthony property again, looking for anything that could connect the home, the car, and the woods. The blanket and laundry bag appeared to support that connection. Evidence from the Pontiac's trunk had already led investigators to believe that human decomposition may have occurred there. The prosecution's developing theory was that Kaylee's body had been kept in the trunk and later transported to the wooded area near the house. It was a coherent sequence. But coherence is not the same as proof. There was no eyewitness to the disposal. The recovery site could not establish when Kaylee had been left there. And without a known cause of death, prosecutors would have to ask a jury to infer the killing from Casey's conduct, her false statements, the car evidence, the computer evidence, and the objects found with Kaylee. The charges now reflected the severity of that theory. Casey faced first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and counts related to the false information she had given investigators. Outside court, the case had already become a national spectacle. Reporters and protesters gathered near the Anthony home. Every family statement was analyzed. Every contradiction became another headline. Public suspicion did not remain focused on Casey. It spread across the family. Inside the house, Cindy and George were moving in different emotional directions. Cindy continued to defend her daughter and resisted conclusions that placed responsibility on Casey. George increasingly believed that Kaylee was dead, even before the remains were formally identified. The difference was not merely about evidence. It was about what each parent could bear to accept. Cindy's loyalty to Casey looked like denial to some observers. George's suspicion looked like betrayal to others. Both were grieving Kaylee while living under relentless public hostility, and both were being asked to take sides before the case had reached a courtroom. For George, that pressure became unbearable. In January 2009, police located him at a hotel after concerns were raised about his safety. He had mixed medication and alcohol and left a lengthy note. In it, he expressed the feeling that he had failed Kaylee. One line read, "Kaylee, here I come." Years later, when George was asked about the suicide attempt, he returned to the same thought, that he had not done enough to find his granddaughter.
During the Anthony's ordeal, a manipulative daughter, a missing granddaughter, George gave up hope and tried to commit suicide. Tell me about the suicide attempt.
I didn't feel I did enough to go find her. Cindy will tell you, I'd be gone from the earliest morning and I could get up till almost probably the next morning again out there looking for her.
That answer is striking because George did not describe the case as an abstract legal failure. He described it as a personal one. He had searched for Kaylee, yet after her remains were found so close to home, the distance must have felt impossible to understand. George survived the attempt, but the family that entered the coming trial was already fractured. Cindy was still protecting Casey. George was carrying grief, suspicion, and guilt. Casey's defense was preparing to use those divisions rather than avoid them. The same parents who had once waited together for Kaylee to come home would soon sit in court while competing explanations placed blame inside their own family. The discovery in the woods resolved the first terrible question. Kaylee was no longer missing. She had died, and someone had left her near the home where she had lived. But the recovery could not supply the one fact the murder charge most needed, a provable account of how she died. When the trial opened in May 2011, the defense did not merely challenge the state's forensic evidence. It told the jury that Kaylee had never been kidnapped at all, and that George Anthony knew the truth from the beginning. The prosecution asked jurors to see 31 days of lies as the behavior of a mother concealing murder. The defense agreed that Casey lied. Then it argued that lying was how she had learned to survive a family secret. Those were the two stories placed before a jury in Orlando in 2011. The trial was nationally televised and followed almost minute by minute. Judge Belvin Perry presided. Jose Baez led Casey Anthony's defense, while prosecutors Jeff Ashton and Linda Drain Burdick presented the case against her. Outside the courthouse, spectators waited for seats. On television, attorneys and former investigators analyzed each witness before the next one had finished testifying. Inside, the case was more difficult than the public conversation often made it sound. George and Cindy Anthony occupied an especially painful position. They were Kaylee's grieving grandparents, but they were also important witnesses whose testimony could help or damage either side. Because they were witnesses, their access to the courtroom was restricted. When they were permitted to attend, they were expected to control visible emotional reactions or risk being removed. That mattered because viewers sometimes interpreted their stillness as coldness. But the courtroom was not giving them the freedom to react naturally. They were watching their daughter stand trial for the death of their granddaughter while knowing that almost any expression could become part of the story. The state's theory was direct. Prosecutors argued that Casey incapacitated Kaylee, possibly using chloroform or another method, and placed duct tape over the child's mouth and nose. They said Kaylee's body was temporarily kept in the trunk of Casey's car before being taken to the wooded area near the Anthony home. But that was the prosecution's reconstruction. It was not an established account of what happened. No witness saw Kaylee being killed. No witness saw her body placed in the car. No witness saw Casey carry her into the woods. The medical examiner could not determine a specific cause of death from the skeletal remains. That left the state to build its case from circumstances surrounding Kaylee's disappearance, Casey's behavior, and the physical evidence recovered months later. And there was a lot to place before the jury. There was the 31-day delay before Kaylee was reported missing. The invented nanny. The empty apartment Casey identified as Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez's home. The job at Universal Studios that Casey no longer had. The odor in the car. The hair from the trunk with characteristics associated with decomposition. The disputed chemical findings. The computer activity involving chloroform-related searches. The duct tape found with Kaylee's skull. The Winnie the Pooh blanket and the laundry bag connected to items inside the Anthony home. Taken together, prosecutors said, those details formed one continuous narrative. Casey's lies were not random. They were designed to buy time and conceal what she had done. Then Jose Baez stood up and offered the jury an entirely different beginning. According to the defense's opening claim, Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family's backyard swimming pool on June 16, 2008. Baez alleged that George found her and helped conceal the death. In that version, Casey's behavior over the next 31 days was still deeply abnormal, but it was not evidence of premeditated murder. The defense asked jurors to see Casey's detachment as part of a lifelong pattern. She denied painful realities. She compartmentalized. She created stories and behaved as though nothing had happened. Baez argued that this was how Casey had learned to function inside her family, not proof that she had intentionally killed Kaylee. To support that explanation, the defense made its most explosive allegation, that George had sexually abused Casey beginning when she was a child. George denied it categorically under oath. The allegation had not been independently substantiated at trial. At the same time, the absence of an earlier disclosure or medical documentation could not, by itself, prove that abuse had or had not occurred. What the jury had was an accusation from the defense and a complete denial from George. Still, the allegation changed the courtroom. George was one of the prosecution's central witnesses. He had experience in law enforcement. He had retrieved the car and described its odor. He spoke about Casey, Kaylee, and the family home. Now the state had to spend valuable time protecting his credibility while also trying to prove its case. That was the defense strategy in its clearest form. If George could not be trusted, then perhaps the story built partly around him could not be trusted either. Other explanations circulated around the family and the public. Cindy considered an accidental drowning possible. George had reportedly wondered whether Zanny the nanny could have been a reference to Xanax, leading to speculation that Kaylee might have been accidentally overdosed while being made to sleep. Others suggested deliberate suffocation with chloroform, duct tape, or both. But none of those possibilities was a proven account. Some were advocacy. Some were family theories. Some were media speculation repeated so often that they began to sound like evidence. That distinction kept getting harder to see. Cindy's testimony about the computer searches created another problem for the state. She claimed responsibility for searches related to chloroform, explaining that she had intended to investigate chlorophyll because the family's dogs had been eating bamboo. Records indicating she may have been at work at the relevant time challenged that account, but her testimony still complicated the effort to connect the searches uniquely and conclusively to Casey. Even the forensic evidence came with arguments attached. Experts disputed what the trunk odor could establish and how reliably decomposition could be identified from air samples. The chemical evidence was contested. The insect evidence was debated. The hair could support the presence of decomposition, but it could not explain exactly when or how Kaylee died. The duct tape looked devastating, yet the condition of the remains made its original position and purpose a subject of dispute. And beneath all of it was the same problem: no proven cause of death. Roy Kronk also became part of the defense attack. He was the utility worker who found Kaylee's remains after previously reporting something suspicious in the area. The defense raised questions about his actions, the timing of his discovery, and whether attention or money influenced him. Those questions were intended to create doubt around the recovery of the remains. They did not establish that Kronk caused Kaylee's death. By then, the trial was doing two jobs at once. It was a homicide prosecution, but it was also a contest over the credibility of nearly every member of the Anthony family. The evidence from the woods competed with accusations from inside the house. Scientific testimony competed with arguments about personalities, secrets, and lies. Outside the courtroom, media coverage often blended those categories together. A proven false statement could sit beside a disputed forensic conclusion, followed by speculation from a commentator, until all three seemed equally certain. The jurors could not decide the case that way. They did not have to determine whether Casey's behavior was suspicious. It plainly was. They did not have to decide whether she lied to investigators. The evidence of that was extensive. For the homicide charges, they had to decide whether the state had proved every required element beyond a reasonable doubt. By closing arguments, prosecutors had assembled a broad circumstantial narrative. The defense had exposed gaps involving cause, mechanism, timing, and individual responsibility. The trial had proved numerous lies, but the homicide counts required more than proof of deception. After weeks of testimony, the jurors deliberated for roughly 10 hours. Then they returned to a courtroom and a country that largely expected one answer. The verdict sounded impossible to many viewers because they were answering a different question from the jury. Public opinion asked who seemed responsible. The verdict form asked what the state had proved. On July 5th, 2011, after roughly 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors returned to the courtroom. By then, the case had become national entertainment, public argument, and courtroom drama all at once. Millions of people had followed the testimony. Many had already decided what the evidence meant. They were waiting for the jury to confirm it. Then the clerk began reading. On the charge of first-degree murder, not guilty. On aggravated child abuse, not guilty. On aggravated manslaughter of a child, not guilty. Casey Anthony had been acquitted of every charge that alleged she was criminally responsible for Kaylee's death. Inside the courtroom, the reaction was controlled but unmistakable. Casey cried and embraced members of her defense team. Her parents, George and Cindy Anthony, remained seated. Throughout the trial, because they were witnesses, they had been allowed to attend under strict expectations about their conduct. Their lack of visible emotion had already been judged by television audiences, often without that context. Outside, restraint disappeared. People gathered near the courthouse reacted with anger and disbelief. Television commentators struggled to explain what had happened. Online, the response was immediate and explosive. Some viewers compared the verdict to other famous acquittals. Others attacked the defense, the justice system, and eventually the jurors themselves. But the jury had not found Casey innocent in the broad, everyday meaning of that word, and it had not ruled that the defense's account was true. An acquittal means something narrower. The prosecution failed to prove the specific charge beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction mattered here because the state had presented a detailed theory of Kaylee's death. Prosecutors argued that Casey had used chloroform to render her daughter unconscious, placed duct tape over her mouth and nose, kept her body in the trunk, and later left her in the wooded area near the Anthony home. It was specific. It gave the jury a sequence. It gave the public an explanation. The problem was that several links in that sequence could not be established with certainty. Kaylee's remains were too decomposed for the medical examiner to determine a precise cause of death. Her death was ruled a homicide, but the examination could not show exactly how she died. There was no confirmed murder weapon. No eyewitness saw Casey kill Kaylee or place her remains in the woods. The exact time of death remained uncertain. The forensic evidence from the car trunk was contested, including the interpretation of the odor, chemical findings, and microscopic hair evidence. Even the duct tape, one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the case, did not answer every question. Its location and meaning were argued intensely, but the condition of the remains limited what could be proved about when or how it had been applied. And there was no conclusive evidence identifying the person who carried Kaylee into those woods. Think about what that left the jury with. Casey had lied about her job. She had lied about the nanny. She had lied about where Kaylee was. She had led investigators through Universal Studios while pretending she worked there. She had waited 31 days without reporting her daughter missing. Those facts were powerful evidence of deception. They were not, by themselves, medical proof of how Kaylee died. That was the gap running through the entire case. The prosecution could prove that Casey repeatedly concealed the truth. It could argue that the concealment showed consciousness of guilt. But to convict her of murder, aggravated child abuse, or aggravated manslaughter, the jurors still had to connect those lies to a legally proven act causing Kaylee's death. The jury concluded that the state had not completed that connection beyond a reasonable doubt. That did not mean the jurors approved of Casey's behavior. Some later said they felt sick about the result. Jurors described an emotionally difficult deliberation and emphasized that they did not trust Casey or consider her conduct acceptable. Their problem was not whether she had lied. Their problem was whether the evidence proved the homicide charges placed in front of them, and the verdict reflected that difference. Casey was found guilty on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement. Those convictions concerned specific lies she told investigators during the missing person inquiry. They were legal findings that she had deliberately misled police. They were not findings that she had killed Kaylee. For people who had watched months of coverage built around Casey as the obvious suspect, that separation was almost impossible to accept. The media had repeated the most incriminating details long before the trial began. Cable news panels debated motive, body language, family behavior, and forensic claims night after night. Photographs of Casey partying during the 31 days became part of the public image of the case. By the time jurors began deliberating, much of the country was not asking whether the state had proved every element. It was waiting to see how severely Casey would be punished. The jury had a narrower job. That difference between the television case and the courtroom case helps explain the fury that followed. The prosecution's public narrative felt complete because it arranged disturbing facts into a coherent story. In court, however, a coherent story still had to survive questions about cause, timing, mechanism, and identity. The jurors' names were temporarily protected as threats and harassment intensified. Even with their identities withheld, they were condemned by people who believed the acquittals could only be explained by ignorance, corruption, or indifference. Some received death threats after performing the task the court had instructed them to perform. You can reject their conclusion. You can believe they weighed the evidence incorrectly. But the legal question was not whether Casey appeared dishonest, selfish, or suspicious. It was whether the prosecution had eliminated reasonable doubt about the charged crimes. On July 7th, Judge Belvin Perry sentenced Casey on the 4 false information convictions. She received 1 year in county jail for each count, along with fines. But Casey had already spent nearly 3 years in custody awaiting trial. With credit for time served and applicable good behavior credit, little of the sentence remained. She was released from jail on July 17th, 2011. Later, legal proceedings changed part of the false statement judgment. A Florida appellate court concluded that multiple lies made during the same continuous police interview could not support 4 separate convictions in the way they had been charged. 2 convictions were set aside, while 2 remained. That ruling did not reopen the homicide case. It did not alter the murder acquittal. It dealt with the legal treatment of Casey's false statements. And the homicide verdicts were final. Under the protection against double jeopardy, Casey could not be tried again for the same murder, aggravated child abuse, or aggravated manslaughter charges after being acquitted. So the trial resolved one question completely. Casey Anthony would not be held criminally responsible for Kaylee's death under those charges. It left the larger factual question untouched. Casey's lies were undeniable. They explained why investigators distrusted her and why the public believed she was hiding something. But lies could not supply the missing cause of death. They could not establish a murder mechanism. They could not prove who placed Kaylee in the woods. The courtroom closed the murder case against Casey, but Casey's own account did not settle into a single version. In later interviews, the last person she claimed had Kaylee would change again. Years after her acquittal, Casey Anthony said she slept well and did not care what the public thought. But she still did not provide one consistent explanation for her daughter's final hours. That contradiction followed her out of jail. After her release, Casey largely disappeared from public view. She filed for bankruptcy and lived in Florida, where she became associated with Patrick McKenna, a private investigator who had worked with her defense team. She developed an interest in photography and talked about using what she had learned from the investigation to work in the private investigation field herself. There were also allegations that Casey had an improper relationship with her attorney, Jose Baez. Those claims were disputed. They were never established as a proven payment arrangement, and speculation about Casey's legal bills should not be treated as fact. Another unresolved piece involved Zenaida Gonzalez, the real woman whose name became tangled in Casey's invented nanny story. Gonzalez pursued defamation litigation after being publicly associated with Kaylee's disappearance. Parts of that litigation were dismissed, and the dispute continued through later legal proceedings. But the central fact never changed. Investigators did not implicate the real Zenaida Gonzalez in Kaylee's disappearance or death. Casey's family, meanwhile, never returned to anything resembling normal. In a later interview, George was asked the simplest version of a painful question. After everything that happened, was Casey still part of his life?
The Anthonys, Casey, her brother Lee, Cindy, and George were once a tight family until they were torn apart by deceit, deception, and death.
What is your relationship with Casey today as we sit here?
I don't have a relationship with my daughter.
Do you want?
That pause says almost as much as the answer. George rejected Casey's allegations against him and remained estranged from her. He later described 2008 as the year he lost both his granddaughter and his daughter. Casey was still alive, but the relationship he once had with her was gone. Cindy's position was more conflicted. She maintained limited contact with Casey and continued to show the loyalty that had defined much of the case. But even Cindy urged her daughter to accept responsibility for whatever she knew. That did not mean Cindy believed every accusation made against Casey. It meant she still wanted an answer. George and Cindy remained uncertain about Kaylee's final moments. Think about that. These were the grandparents who had helped raise her, lived with her, and searched for an explanation after she disappeared. Years later, they still could not say with confidence how she died. Lee Anthony also kept his distance from Casey. As the family moved forward, another concern emerged, protecting a younger generation from a case that refused to leave the public eye. The Anthony name had become attached not only to Kaylee's death, but to televised arguments, accusations, and endless online judgment. Keeping children away from that exposure became its own form of damage control. Then, in 2017, Casey returned to public attention.
What the hell did you do for all these years?
And what Casey is doing now is once again sparking outrage.
I'm still not even certain as I stand here today about what happened.
To help promote her new career as a photographer, Casey gave a jaw-dropping interview to Associated Press reporter Josh Replogle.
The interview did not settle anything. It created another version. Casey said she remembered saying goodbye to Cindy that morning, going back to sleep, and later discovering that Kaylee was missing. She also said George had Kaylee when she last saw her and claimed she did not know what happened afterward. But compare that with the earlier stories. At first, Casey said a nanny had taken Kaylee and refused to return her. At trial, the defense argued that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool and that George helped conceal the death. Now Casey was again describing Kaylee as missing and placing her last known custody with George. Those accounts do not fit together. A kidnapping by a fictional nanny is not an accidental drowning. An accidental drowning is not a child simply disappearing after being left with her grandfather. Casey either refused or was unable to provide a stable narrative connecting Kaylee's last confirmed sighting to the discovery of her remains. Casey told the Associated Press that she was okay with herself. She said she slept well. Asked what Kaylee might have been like at 12, Casey imagined her as athletic, interested in classic rock, and unwilling to take abuse from anyone. Against that confidence stood the experience of Kaylee's grandparents.
Get a restful night's sleep. I know she hasn't for years.
And also in the AP interview, Casey seemingly refuses any responsibility for what happened to little Kaylee.
I don't give a about what anybody thinks about me.
That was the divide now. Casey presenting herself as unaffected by public judgment, while George and Cindy continued living with questions that had never been answered. George had already reached a breaking point once. In January 2009, he was found in a hotel after mixing alcohol and medication in what he described as a suicide attempt. He had written a note that ended with the words, "Kaylee, here I come." He survived. But Kaylee's memory remained central to his life. George and Cindy continued living in the home associated with her childhood, the house where she had played, used the pool, and spent time with her grandparents. It was also the house that had become inseparable from the investigation. Later discoveries added another layer. In 2017, reporting drew renewed attention to a Firefox search for foolproof suffocation on the Anthony family computer. The timing reportedly placed Casey at home. It was also reported that browser history had been deleted or cleared shortly before her arrest. It sounds explosive. But here is the legal problem. The jury never evaluated that search during the 2011 trial. The information was not presented as part of the prosecution's case, so jurors could not weigh its reliability, timing, authorship, or meaning. And after an acquittal, a disturbing internet search does not automatically become a new criminal case. Investigators would still need admissible evidence connecting the search to a specific person, act, and charge. Suspicion is not enough. Neither is hindsight. That gap, between what looks incriminating and what can be proved, has always been the center of this case. The televised trial helped turn that gap into a cultural event. Millions of viewers watched testimony in real time, formed immediate conclusions, and treated the verdict like a public referendum. When jurors acquitted Casey of the homicide charges, some received threats. Their names became objects of public interest, as though refusing to convict without sufficient proof made them responsible for Kaylee's death. But jurors were never asked whether Casey lied. She was convicted of doing that. They were asked whether the state had proved the charged crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. Years of appeals, interviews, lawsuits, and newly publicized evidence did not produce a definitive account of Kaylee's death, nor did they establish an alternative account in court.
Well, let's hope she's listening to what George is saying, which is stop saying things about me that aren't true. We have to remember one thing about this case. This case is still open, active, and according to law enforcement, unsolved. So let's hope she's thinking about coming clean and telling us what happened to Kaylee Anthony.
And that is where the story remains. Casey Anthony was acquitted of causing Kaylee's death. The precise cause and circumstances of that death remain undetermined. No competing explanation has been established in court. So was the verdict a failure of the prosecution, the proper result of reasonable doubt, or both at the same time? The final image should not belong to Casey. It belongs to the photographs of Kaylee at home, in the pool, and beside the grandparents who still speak about her. Then to the wooded memorial bearing her name near the place where her remains were found. The legal answer is final. The factual story is incomplete. Tell me in the comments which evidentiary gap mattered most to you, and subscribe for the next case. Kaylee's final hours remain unanswered.